January 17, 1945. Dawn broke over the frost-bitten fields of northeastern France. The air was sharp, tinged with smoke, and the scent of churned earth. Convoys of trucks rumbled steadily along the narrow, mud-choked roads, their engines growling beneath a sky bruised with winter clouds. Drivers, their faces red from the cold, clutched steering wheels frozen to the touch, eyes scanning for potholes, debris, and the occasional Luftwaffe reconnaissance plane. Across the front, in a dimly lit command bunker, German generals hunched over maps, cups of coffee growing cold in their hands. They laughed at reports of endless American truck convoys, dismissing them as trivial. "Trucks will never feed an army," one remarked, voice dripping with certainty. Yet, outside, the relentless flow of supplies, fuel, ammunition, rations crept ever forward, unseen arteries of steel sustaining an army's lifeblood. The contrast was stark: German arrogance and American precision. A quiet, unglamorous battle was unfolding, one that would quietly decide the fate of armies. Trucks, often mocked, carried the weight of victory itself. And soon, the truth would crash upon the German command with the force of a winter storm. The morning mist swallowed the horizon, and with it, the line between hubris and reality. By mid-1944, the European theater of World War II had entered a phase of relentless motion. The D-Day landings of June 6, 1944, had established a tenuous foothold on the Normandy coast, but the Allied advance inland was far from guaranteed. Roads were cratered by bombing, towns lay in ruins, and every mile eastward was a battlefield in miniature. German forces, though battered, remained formidable, their panzer divisions and well-drilled infantry capable of sudden, devastating counterattacks. Yet amid these tactical clashes, a subtler struggle was unfolding, the race to supply men and machines across vast distances. The German High Command had long underestimated the logistical prowess of the United States. To them, American supply was assumed to be cumbersome, inefficient, and vulnerable. Intelligence reports often mocked the notion of a continental-sized army sustained by motor vehicles over shattered roads, presuming fuel shortages and mechanical failures would soon cripple the advancing Allies. What they did not anticipate was the scale, ingenuity, and organization behind American logistics. Convoys were carefully scheduled, routes meticulously planned, and maintenance teams deployed to preempt breakdowns. One remarkable example was the Red Ball Express. Established in August 1944, it was an extraordinary operation, designed to move massive quantities of fuel, ammunition, and food from the Normandy beaches to the front lines. Hundreds of trucks, manned largely by African American soldiers, operated around the clock. Routes were one-way, checkpoints tightly controlled, and rest and repair stations positioned like clockwork along the paths. The German generals, watching from their maps, could not imagine an army being fed, armed, and fueled entirely by rolling steel. The American logistical apparatus did more than deliver supplies; it shaped the battlefield itself. Infantry units could advance without pause, armored divisions could maintain momentum, and air support could strike far behind enemy lines. Every crate delivered, every gallon of fuel pumped, was a silent weapon against German assumptions. Meanwhile, German reconnaissance struggled to discern the method behind the seemingly endless flow of convoys. Reports filtered up the chain of command described long lines of trucks moving under artillery fire, yet they dismissed these as minor irritations, rather than the strategic lifeline they truly were. The terrain of northern France was unforgiving. Narrow roads, destroyed bridges, and war-torn towns created a gauntlet that would have stalled less organized forces. Yet the Red Ball Express ran with remarkable efficiency. Soldiers and drivers endured freezing nights, mechanical breakdowns, and the constant threat of enemy artillery. The work was grueling, repetitive, and largely invisible to the broader public. But the cumulative effect was monumental. German commanders, still reliant on traditional assumptions about supply, continued to scoff at the Americans' truck armies. Meanwhile, the broader context of the war intensified the stakes. Hitler's forces were stretched across multiple fronts, supplies from occupied territories were dwindling, and fuel shortages began to bite. In contrast, the Allies had not only the industrial capacity of the United States, but also the organizational skill to translate production into battlefield readiness. Every tank, every artillery piece, every ration delivered to the front amplified the pressure on German defenses. The logistical machinery of the U.S. Army was not a background operation, it was the engine propelling victory forward. By the winter of 1944, the stage was set. German generals, confident in their tactical superiority and dismissive of American supply lines, had no inkling that the very arteries they considered trivial would soon determine the fate of entire campaigns. The invisible struggle of trucks and roads, maintenance crews and supply officers, was about to collide head-on with German hubris. And when it did, the consequences would be undeniable. As autumn bled into winter 1944, the scale of the Allied logistical effort became increasingly apparent, but only slowly to the Germans. German intelligence had intercepted reports of convoys moving at unprecedented rates, yet these were often dismissed as exaggerations or misinterpretations. Maps in command bunkers displayed lines of American trucks stretching across the countryside like threads in a tapestry. But the generals saw them as inconsequential, failing to grasp that each vehicle carried more than supplies. It carried the capacity to sustain an army in motion. The Red Ball Express had grown into a massive operation. By September 1944, thousands of trucks were dedicated to feeding frontline units. Fuel, ammunition, rations, and medical supplies flowed unceasingly from ports, such as Cherbourg and Normandy beaches, deep into the liberated territories. Routes were clearly designated one-way arteries reducing congestion, repair depots positioned strategically to minimize downtime, and drivers rotating shifts to keep operations continuous. Night convoys moved under blackout conditions, often navigating destroyed infrastructure and mined roads, their progress invisible to observers who relied on outdated intelligence models. German forces, meanwhile, were operating under assumptions formed in earlier campaigns. They had long relied on rapid movement, tactical superiority, and the disruption of enemy supply to win battles. The idea that a mechanized force could be sustained over hundreds of kilometers, day after day, by orderly convoys of trucks seemed implausible. Reports from front-line units describing the relentless flow of fuel and ammunition were interpreted as anomalies rather than indicators of a systematic advantage. German commanders mocked these truck armies, convinced that attrition, weather, and mechanical failure would soon halt the Americans. Yet reality contradicted expectation. The scale of American production, combined with meticulous logistical planning, created an almost industrial rhythm to the war. Factories in the United States were producing thousands of trucks, jeeps, and tanks each month, while specialized maintenance units ensured that vehicles could remain operational even in the harshest conditions. Supply officers tracked every crate, every barrel, and every convoy, adjusting schedules dynamically to respond to the shifting front lines. For German generals, who were used to seeing supply bottlenecks, slow campaigns to a crawl, the efficiency of the U.S. Army was almost unbelievable. Particularly revealing was the use of African American soldiers in logistical roles, especially in the Red Ball Express. Operating under conditions of extreme stress, cold, and danger, these drivers and mechanics kept the supply lines moving, often under fire from retreating German forces. Their contribution was vital and often overlooked in the broader narratives of heroism. Yet without their perseverance, Allied advances might have stalled. For the Germans, this human element, dedication, discipline, and ingenuity, added another layer of confusion to their assessments. By late December 1944, German reconnaissance confirmed what they had refused to believe: the Americans were not only maintaining supply lines but expanding them, enabling forces to strike deeper, faster, and more consistently than expected. The logistical network was no longer a background function. It had become a decisive element of combat power. German generals, who had once mocked the idea of trucks sustaining an army, began to see the truth creeping into their own operational planning. Supply lines, previously ignored or underestimated, now dictated the tempo of battles and the effectiveness of German responses. As winter storms raged across the Ardennes and northern France, the stage was set for a confrontation between German arrogance and American organizational mastery. The Red Ball Express and its sister operations would become not merely a support system, but a force multiplier, a hidden weapon whose impact would soon be undeniable on the battlefield. The German command's skepticism was about to collide with reality, and the shock would resonate far beyond the front lines. The men who drove the Red Ball Express were ordinary soldiers, performing extraordinary work. Many were young, often barely out of training, thrown into a relentless schedule that demanded endurance, precision, and courage. They faced freezing winds, mud-choked roads, and the constant threat of artillery fire or enemy ambushes. Nights were long, with blackout conditions forcing drivers to navigate by instinct, memory, and faint light from cracked headlights. Yet morale was held together by discipline and camaraderie. The success of the mission depended on each individual doing their part flawlessly. Each crate delivered, each gallon of fuel pumped, was a silent triumph against the elements, the clock, and enemy observation. These were the unsung heroes, operating far from the glory of the front lines, whose labor kept tanks rolling, guns firing, and soldiers fed. The American logistical machine relied on more than manpower. It was a carefully orchestrated network of technology, machinery, and engineering. Trucks such as the GMC CCKWs, Deuce and a Half, formed the backbone of operations, designed for durability, repairability, and long-range capability. Maintenance units were deployed at intervals along every route, prepared to replace engines, patch punctured tires, or improvise solutions from limited spare parts. Supply depots functioned like clockwork, with cranes, forklifts, and storage systems optimized to minimize downtime. Communications networks allowed headquarters to monitor convoy positions, track fuel consumption, and adjust priorities in real time. Against this backdrop, the Germans, relying on outdated assumptions about mechanized supply, could scarcely comprehend the seamless integration of technology and manpower that kept the American war machine moving. Logistical mastery translated directly into battlefield advantage. The ability to deliver fuel to armored units within hours, rather than days, allowed commanders to maintain momentum, exploit breakthroughs, and outmaneuver German forces. Artillery units could be resupplied rapidly, enabling sustained barrages that softened enemy defenses. Air support, dependent on forward fuel depots and ammunition, could strike deeper and more frequently, forcing German units to spread thin. In essence, supply lines were no longer a backdrop, they were an active participant in combat. Each truck in motion was a force multiplier, each resupplied division a strategic lever capable of tipping the scales in favor of the Allies. The Germans, accustomed to supply shortages hindering campaigns, were blindsided by the speed and scale of this operational advantage. The success of Allied logistics was as much about leadership as it was about manpower or machinery. Officers coordinated convoys, maintenance, and supply depots with meticulous precision. Plans were adjusted daily to account for weather, enemy action, and road conditions. Commanders on the ground made split-second decisions that prevented bottlenecks and ensured continuous flow. Major General William H. Simpson, overseeing parts of the Red Ball Express, exemplified this combination of strategic foresight and operational discipline. His insistence on strict scheduling, rotation of drivers, and pre-positioning of fuel depots ensured that frontline units never paused for lack of supplies. Meanwhile, German commanders, convinced that American supply was overstretched, failed to anticipate the strategic impact of such organized oversight. For the German generals, the operational reality of U.S. logistics was a blow to pride and morale. Initially, they mocked the idea that trucks could sustain an entire army in combat conditions, believing their own mobility and tactical prowess would dictate outcomes. Yet as reports of sustained advances and consistent resupply arrived, disbelief turned into shock. Frontline German officers, witnessing American divisions continue forward without hesitation, could see firsthand the effects of well-executed logistics. The psychological impact was profound. A mockery gave way to a grudging respect, tinged with frustration at underestimating an enemy's unseen strengths. The sheer scale of the Red Ball Express was staggering. By some estimates, over 6,000 trucks operated continuously, delivering more than 12,000 tons of supplies daily across hundreds of kilometers. Fuel depots, repair stations, and loading docks were networked across liberated France, functioning with industrial efficiency. The numbers were incomprehensible to German intelligence, accustomed to slower, attrition-driven campaigns. Every statistic, the miles traveled, gallons of fuel delivered, tons of ammunition moved, translated directly into operational capability. The American logistical feat was both a testament to industrial power and an illustration of how effective planning could multiply combat potential far beyond what brute force alone could achieve. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes forest was cloaked in early morning fog, frost glinting on the underbrush, as German forces launched their last major offensive in the West, the Battle of the Bulge. Tanks rumbled through snow-laden roads, infantry pushed forward through dense woods, and artillery opened sudden, deafening fire on isolated villages. German commanders, emboldened by surprise, expected the American forces to falter under the pressure of winter, exhaustion, and disrupted supply. They underestimated one critical factor: the unbroken lifeline of U.S. logistics. Convoys of the Red Ball Express and supplementary supply units worked tirelessly to funnel fuel, ammunition, and rations to the frontline divisions. Trucks moved under artillery fire and aerial reconnaissance, drivers braving icy roads and shell-shattered bridges. Maintenance crews patched broken axles and replaced engines in the field, ensuring that vehicles kept rolling. Infantry units, sustained by hot rations and ammunition delivered at astonishing speed, dug in, counterattacked, and held critical crossroads. American armored divisions, fueled and ready, struck back with coordinated precision that German intelligence had not predicted. By December 20, German generals began to realize the scope of what they had mocked. Their assumptions about American vulnerability crumbled as tanks advanced beyond expected limits, Supply units appeared in previously isolated sectors, and artillery remained relentlessly effective. Field reports detailed divisions resupplied in record time, convoy after convoy arriving despite adverse conditions. Shock and disbelief rippled through the German command structure. The enemy they had assumed would stall under logistical strain was not only sustained, but maneuvering with efficiency that rivaled their own doctrine. This was more than a tactical surprise, it was a strategic revelation. The Red Ball Express and American supply mastery had turned the tide of the offensive before it could fully unfold. Every mile of unbroken convoy, every barrel of fuel delivered under fire, was a hammer striking at the foundation of German overconfidence. Commanders like General Hasso von Manteuffel, who had planned armored thrusts, expecting weakened American resistance, now faced a reality they could neither easily counter nor fully comprehend. The clash between German hubris and Allied organizational excellence reached a crescendo as the first elements of the U.S. 4th and 7th Armies counterattacked, exploiting the very corridors of supply that German forces had assumed were irrelevant. By late December 1944, the Ardennes offensive had stalled. But not due to frontline courage alone. It was the sustained power of American logistics that dictated the battlefield tempo. German armored units, running low on fuel and ammunition, ground to a halt. Infantry, outmaneuvered and facing well, supplied counterattacks faltered. Meanwhile, convoys from the Red Ball Express delivered thousands of tons of essential supplies daily, ensuring that every American division could maintain cohesion and momentum despite the harsh winter. The German High Command, watching reports filter in from the front, could scarcely believe the figures. Entire divisions had advanced 20, 30, sometimes 40 kilometers without pause, their mobility and striking power unbroken by terrain or weather. The logistical apparatus that had once seemed trivial, countless trucks, rotating drivers, repair crews operating under enemy observation, had become the decisive instrument of war. Generals who had mocked American supply lines now faced the bitter reality that the very thing they had missed was the backbone of an army capable of repelling their most audacious attacks. On December 26, counterattacks by the U.S. 3rd and 9th Armies began to cut into German positions. American tanks, fully fueled, advanced along routes carefully maintained by the supply units. Artillery, resupplied and calibrated, pounded German positions, creating openings for infantry to reclaim lost territory. Every success on the battlefield was a direct product of sustained supply. Every stalled German maneuver was a reflection of their failure to anticipate this invisible but formidable power. By the final days of December, German forces were in retreat. Fuel shortages, lack of ammunition, and overextended lines rendered their offensive unsustainable. Reports from front line commanders admitted, often grudgingly, that American logistical mastery had prevented what might have been a catastrophic breakthrough. The mockery that had echoed through German command bunkers months earlier had transformed into a reluctant recognition. The Americans had built an engine of war whose scale and precision could not be ignored. The Ardennes would later be remembered as a dramatic, desperate battle of wills, but beneath the snow and gunfire, it was supply that had shaped the outcome. Trucks, once dismissed as mundane, had become instruments of strategy. Convoys, maintenance crews, and planners had turned the tide before many generals even realized the true nature of the force arrayed against them. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, German assumptions collided violently with operational reality, and the consequences would resonate far beyond the battlefield. By early January 1945, the Ardennes offensive had collapsed. German forces were in full retreat, their advance halted not by a single decisive battle, but by the cumulative effects of sustained, well-executed Allied logistics. Reports from the front highlighted the stark contrast between expectation and reality. Units that German commanders assumed would stall for lack of fuel or ammunition continued to fight effectively, resupplied by an invisible network that stretched from Normandy to the front lines. The failure of the offensive exposed the limitations of German planning and the overconfidence of their command structure. The material and human toll on German forces was significant. Thousands of soldiers were captured or killed during the retreat. Tanks abandoned due to fuel shortages littered snow-covered roads, and artillery pieces fell silent for lack of ammunition. In contrast, American units sustained comparatively low casualties and maintained operational mobility, thanks in no small part to the tireless work of supply personnel. Convoys continued to run despite enemy action, cold weather, and destroyed infrastructure, ensuring that fuel, ammunition, and rations reached every division at the precise moment they were needed. Beyond the battlefield, the psychological impact on German generals was profound. The hubris that had led them to dismiss American logistics was replaced with grudging acknowledgement. Field reports repeatedly emphasized the efficiency of supply lines, the resilience of truck convoys under fire, and the organizational skill of American planners. Memoirs and post-war interviews would later recount the surprise and respect engendered by the Red Ball Express and similar operations. German officers recognized that they had misjudged the scale and importance of logistics, and this miscalculation had direct consequences on operational outcomes. The collapse of the Ardennes offensive demonstrated a critical lesson. Battlefield tactics alone could not secure victory. The ability to move men, machines, and material efficiently across vast distances had become a decisive factor. Allied logistics had not merely supported combat operations, they had defined them. Frontline soldiers, armored units, and artillery batteries owed their continued effectiveness to the unsung heroes operating the convoys, warehouses, and maintenance depots behind the lines. In the weeks following the Ardennes retreat, the strategic consequences of American logistical superiority became increasingly evident. German forces, already strained across multiple fronts, were unable to recover quickly. Fuel shortages persisted, ammunition stocks were depleted, and winter conditions compounded the inability to redeploy units effectively. The Allies, conversely, leveraged their supply advantage to launch coordinated counteroffensives, regaining territory and securing key towns with speed that German planners could not match. The failure of the offensive highlighted the growing disparity between the two sides' operational capabilities, an imbalance rooted not in frontline courage, but in the mastery of logistics. Captured German reports from the period reflect a sobering recognition. The Americans had created a system capable of sustaining an army over vast distances under conditions that would have crippled most European forces. One memo from a senior officer noted, with rare candor, that supply lines operate with the precision of a clock, delivering fuel and munitions where we expected only delay and shortage. Another report expressed frustration that every attempted disruption of the convoys had minimal effect. The sheer redundancy, planning, and discipline of American supply operations rendered sabotage and ambush less effective than anticipated. The lesson extended beyond the immediate battlefield. High command in both the U.S. and Germany now understood that logistics could dictate strategy. For the Germans, it was a bitter acknowledgement of their prior underestimation. For the Allies, it validated the investment in infrastructure, coordination, and industrial output. The Red Ball Express maintenance crews and supply depots were recognized as critical enablers of operational flexibility. Elements as decisive as tanks, artillery, or infantry formations. Furthermore, the episode influenced post-war military thought. Analysts studied the Ardennes to understand how supply, often overlooked in tactical planning, could determine the outcome of entire campaigns. The apparent triviality of truck convoys had been revealed as a cornerstone of success, a reminder that battles are won not only through combat but through the silent, relentless work that keeps an army fed, armed, and mobile. The German general's mockery had given way to grudging respect, but the truth could not be undone. Operational reality had proven incontrovertible. Logistics had won the day, transforming what many assumed to be mundane support into the decisive instrument of war. As the winter snows receded, the Allies advanced with confidence, sustained by the invisible arteries of supply that had humbled even the most seasoned of German commanders. In the quiet aftermath of the Ardennes, as snow melted over shattered roads and weary soldiers moved forward, the significance of what had transpired settled into history. Victory was not achieved solely through brilliant tactics or audacious maneuvers. It was sustained by the tireless, invisible labor of logistics. Trucks rumbled across frozen fields, fuel flowed into tanks, ammunition reached gunners, and rations nourished men who had endured relentless hardship. The Germans had mocked it all, only to learn that the mundane could become extraordinary. The story of the Red Ball Express and American supply mastery underscores a timeless truth of warfare. The infrastructure of victory is often hidden from view, yet its impact is undeniable. Industrial might, planning, discipline, and human perseverance converged to create a force multiplier that no enemy could ignore. The hubris of German generals collided with the meticulous orchestration of supply lines, and in that collision, the course of campaigns, and ultimately the war, was shaped. Beyond strategy and combat, there is a human lesson. The soldiers, drivers, mechanics, and planners who toiled in obscurity were the silent architects of success. Their labor carried not just material, but hope, endurance, and the unbroken will of an army. History often celebrates the generals and battles, but here, in the frost and fog of northern France, the quiet heroism of those behind the lines proved decisive. Ultimately, this episode reminds us that victory is as much about foresight, organization, and resilience as it is about valor. The lesson resonates beyond war. Preparation, dedication, and unseen effort can overturn even the most confident assumptions. German generals learned this truth too late, but the story endures, a testament to the power of the unglamorous, the precise, and the relentless force of human and logistical ingenuity.